Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are traveling through time back to the days of palaces lit by candlelight, where history was not just written in ink but carved out in ambition, family rivalries, and survival. Our journey begins with the birth of a girl who would eventually become one of the most legendary rulers of England, Elizabeth I. I want you to imagine this clearly. The year is 1533. The air inside Greenwich Palace carries the smell of burning wood from great fireplaces, herbs scattered across the floors to mask less pleasant odors, and the faint dampness that clings to every stone wall. Outside, the River Thames rolls by slowly under a grey English sky, carrying the sounds of merchants shouting, horses clattering on cobblestones, and voices echoing from passing boats. In this world of both grandeur and discomfort, a baby has just been born. Her name is Elizabeth. She has no idea that her arrival will change the course of history, nor that her life will be filled with danger and uncertainty from the very start. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. To most parents, the birth of a healthy child would have been a moment of pure joy. But for Henry, it was a disappointment. He had torn England away from the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and made enemies across Europe in pursuit of one goal: a son to secure his dynasty. After all that, what he received was a daughter. For us today, that might sound absurd. How could the gender of a baby matter so much? But in the 16th century, it mattered more than almost anything. Sons were seen as heirs, the continuation of a dynasty. Daughters were pawns to be married off for political gain. So from the moment of her first cry, Elizabeth was caught in the shadow of her father's frustration. This is where the story of Elizabeth becomes so profoundly human. Imagine being born into a family where your worth is doubted before you can even speak. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had risked everything to marry Henry. She was his great gamble, the woman for whom he had upended both religion and politics. Everyone expected her to give him the son he craved. Instead, she gave him Elizabeth, and named her daughter after both grandmothers, perhaps hoping to anchor her in family traditions, perhaps believing it was the safest choice. But even that could not soften Henry's disappointment. Let us pause here for a moment. It is easy to think of these events as distant, locked in history books. But if you strip away the crowns and palaces, what you see is something that many people today can relate to: the pain of failing to meet someone else's expectations. Elizabeth's arrival was not celebrated as it should have been. And in many ways, she grew up under the cloud of not being enough for her father. And yet, as history would prove, she turned that into her greatest strength. When others dismissed her, she learned to listen, to watch, and to adapt. Back at Greenwich, Elizabeth's early days were spent in a palace that was grand but far from comfortable. The floors were layered with straw rushes meant to soak up the dirt. Fires filled the halls with warmth, but also smoke that clung to the tapestries. Heavy fabrics on the walls could not keep out the English chill. It was a strange world, part luxury, part hardship. Elizabeth was surrounded by the symbols of power, yet her position within that power was already unstable. For Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's birth was both triumph and tragedy. On one hand, she had given Henry a living, healthy child, which was no small feat in an age when many infants did not survive. On the other, she knew Henry's expectations had not been met. Her place at court was fragile, and Elizabeth's future was tied to it. If Anne fell, Elizabeth would fall with her. And within just a few short years, that is exactly what happened. In 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, Anne Boleyn was accused of crimes adultery, treason, and worse charges that most historians believe were fabricated to clear the way for Henry to marry again, and was executed at the Tower of London. And Elizabeth, barely old enough to form full sentences, was declared illegitimate. In a single day, the little girl who had been a princess with every privilege became an outcast. Her household reduced, her title stripped away, and her position uncertain. Imagine being that child. One day you are surrounded by servants, fine clothes, and endless attention. The next, the whispers around you are filled with fear, the faces of your caretakers clouded with worry. And the world you knew disappears. Elizabeth could not yet grasp what was happening, but the effects of that upheaval would shape her entire character. She learned early that status could vanish overnight, that power was fragile, and that survival required resilience. And here is where her story offers something to us today. Elizabeth could have faded into obscurity, as many children in her position did. But instead, she grew into someone who learned from instability rather than being broken by it. She turned disappointment into determination, rejection into resolve. Greatness is rarely born in comfort. It is shaped by struggle. So this is where our journey with Elizabeth begins. A baby born into grandeur but marked by her father's disapproval, a child whose first years were filled with uncertainty, and a young girl destined to face more challenges than most adults could ever imagine. In the next part of our story, we will follow her into those uncertain years after her mother's fall, and we will see how she adapted to loss, isolation, and shifting fortune, building the foundations of the queen she would one day become. After the fall of her mother and the loss of her title, Elizabeth's world shifted once again. She was no longer the pampered princess in the cradle of Greenwich. Instead, she grew up in smaller households, surrounded not by the pomp of court but by a quieter, more uncertain existence. Yet in that quieter space, something remarkable began to take shape. Elizabeth's mind. Unlike many girls of her time, Elizabeth was given an education that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, that of her male counterparts. This was not an accident. Henry VIII might have been disappointed in her at first, but later wives of Henry, particularly Catherine Parr, took a keen interest in Elizabeth's development. Catherine believed that girls deserved a proper education, a revolutionary thought in the 16th century. She made sure Elizabeth had access to the best tutors, scholars who could train her in languages, history, philosophy, and theology. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth could speak Latin, Greek, French, and Italian fluently. Imagine that for a moment, a girl growing up in an age when most women were taught little more than household skills was instead learning to debate in the languages of ancient Rome and Greece. Elizabeth did not simply study because it was expected of her. She loved learning. She devoured knowledge, treating books as allies, ideas as weapons, and languages as doors to other worlds. And this passion did not just give her a sharp mind. It gave her a kind of independence that no title or wealth could ever guarantee. When her royal status was unstable, education became her shield. When her future was uncertain, wisdom became her compass. Her bond with her younger brother Edward was another anchor in these years. Edward, the long-awaited male heir, was the golden child in their father's eyes. Yet instead of being rivals, the two siblings found common ground. They were both isolated from other children their age, raised in an environment where every move was observed, every word weighed. Together they found comfort in books and lessons, often learning side by side. Edward admired his sister's intelligence, and Elizabeth admired his quick grasp of ideas. It is not hard to imagine the two of them, still young, sitting under the watchful eye of a tutor, scribbling notes in Latin, exchanging thoughts with the ease of two bright minds who had no one else to talk to on their level. Now, why does this matter? Because in those shared lessons and stolen hours of companionship, Elizabeth learned empathy. She understood what it was like to live under pressure, to be judged not just for who you were but for what you represented. That empathy would later guide her as a queen, helping her to balance the fierce divisions in her country with a kind of cautious understanding. But education was not only about books. It was also about survival. Elizabeth's tutors taught her to argue, to analyze, to think strategically. These were not abstract lessons, they were training for a world where one wrong word could lead to imprisonment, where silence could be more powerful than speech, and where being underestimated could be turned into an advantage. Many historians believe that Elizabeth's poise in later crises, the way she could face interrogation without crumbling, the way she could outmaneuver seasoned politicians, was born in these early classrooms. She learned not only what to say but when not to say it. It is worth pausing here and drawing a parallel to our own lives. Think of times when learning something new has opened doors you did not know existed. Maybe it was picking up a language, a new skill, or even just reading the right book at the right time. Education is not only about passing exams or earning degrees. It is about equipping ourselves to navigate the unexpected. Elizabeth did not know she would one day be queen. In fact, for much of her youth, it seemed impossible. But when the crown eventually came, it was her education that made her ready. Her love for knowledge also made her adaptable. England during her childhood was a land of religious turbulence. One year, the official faith leaned Protestant. The next, Catholic practices were restored. Families and communities were torn apart by these swings. Elizabeth's studies in theology, philosophy, and languages gave her the ability to see beyond dogma. She could understand arguments on both sides, and later as queen, this flexibility allowed her to craft a religious settlement that avoided extremes. Where others saw only black and white, Elizabeth could navigate the gray. And yet, even as she studied and bonded with her brother, Elizabeth was learning another, harsher lesson: knowledge alone did not protect her from danger. The people around her, advisors, stepmothers, guardians, sometimes had their own ambitions, and Elizabeth's position as a royal child made her vulnerable to manipulation. One of the most infamous examples came in her teenage years, with Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr's new husband after Henry's death. Seymour's inappropriate behavior toward Elizabeth forced her to recognize just how precarious her position was as a young woman in a male-dominated world. That early brush with danger imprinted on her the importance of caution, composure, and self-control. Through it all, Elizabeth built a foundation of empathy and alliance. She connected with Edward in genuine friendship, showing that even in a court built on suspicion, trust could exist. She impressed her tutors with her brilliance, forming bonds with scholars who saw in her a spark of potential far beyond what anyone expected of a girl. And she began to practice the art of listening, waiting, and watching, a skill that would become one of her greatest strengths as queen. By the time she entered her late teens, Elizabeth was not just the daughter of a disgraced queen and a disappointed king. She was a young woman with a mind sharpened by study, a heart tempered by empathy, and a survival instinct honed by experience. The girl who had once been dismissed as a political afterthought was quietly becoming a force to be reckoned with. And though she did not yet know it, the education and alliances she cultivated in those years would soon help her weather storms far greater than she could imagine. So when we think of Elizabeth's early years, we should not only see the shadows of her father's disappointment or the tragedy of her mother's execution. We should also see the glow of candlelight over her books, the laughter she shared with her brother during lessons, the determination in her eyes as she mastered a new language. These were not just childhood memories. They were the building blocks of a queen. The quiet preparation for a life that would demand every ounce of intelligence, resilience, and empathy she could muster. Elizabeth's youth of study and reflection eventually gave way to the storm of politics that engulfed her when her half-sister, Mary Tudor, took the throne. If Elizabeth's childhood had taught her resilience, her early adulthood would test it to the limit. She was no longer a child tucked away with her tutors. Now, she was a young woman in her 20s, standing in the middle of England's religious upheavals, surrounded by suspicion, fear, and enemies waiting for her to make one wrong move. When King Edward VI died in 1553, the throne passed not to Elizabeth but to Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary was deeply Catholic, and she had waited her entire life for this moment. She was determined to undo the Protestant reforms of her father and brother, to restore England to the Catholic faith. But there was a problem. Elizabeth had been educated by Protestant tutors, raised in an environment that leaned toward reform, and she was now the most obvious alternative to Mary's Catholic rule. To many Protestants in England, Elizabeth was not just another royal. She was hope itself. This placed Elizabeth in a dangerous position. She was not openly rebelling, but she did not have to. Her very existence made her a target. Rebellions and conspiracies began to form, and Elizabeth's name was whispered among them as a figurehead, whether she had any involvement or not. One of the most notable was Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, a Protestant uprising against Mary's plan to marry Philip II of Spain. The rebels claimed they were protecting England from being swallowed by foreign Catholic influence. And naturally, rumors swirled that Elizabeth was secretly supporting them. Mary acted quickly. Elizabeth was summoned to court and questioned. For a young woman in her early 20s, the pressure must have been immense. Imagine standing in front of your sister, the Queen, accused of treason, knowing that a single word could be twisted into evidence against you. But Elizabeth showed the same discipline she had learned as a child in her lessons. She denied involvement calmly, clearly, without anger or fear. Her answers were measured, her face composed. It was a performance of survival. And it worked at least for a while. But suspicion did not disappear so easily. Elizabeth was eventually arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Think about that for a moment, the same fortress where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been imprisoned and executed now held Elizabeth within its cold stone walls. The echoes of history must have haunted her. She knew what had happened to her mother. She knew what fate often awaited prisoners accused of treason. And yet, she endured. In her cell, Elizabeth was watched constantly, her correspondence monitored, her servants questioned. She survived not by lashing out, but by relying on her composure and her intelligence. She understood that Mary could easily have her executed, but she also knew that killing her sister would alienate many nobles who still respected the Tudor bloodline. Elizabeth's tactic was patience. She kept her words careful, her demeanor respectful, and she waited. What is striking here is how Elizabeth's survival strategy mirrors something many of us face in difficult environments. Sometimes the smartest move is not confrontation, but restraint. In a workplace, for example, when accusations fly or politics turn ugly, it is often those who observe carefully, who speak with precision, who manage to weather the storm. Elizabeth embodied that principle centuries before we had a name for it. Eventually, Mary released Elizabeth from the Tower, though she remained under watch at various country estates. But the danger never truly disappeared. Every rebellion, every rumor of dissent seemed to circle back to her. She was always one step away from disaster. And yet, she never gave Mary a concrete reason to act against her. She played the role of the dutiful sister, attending court when summoned, expressing loyalty, never openly defying Mary's Catholic restoration. All the while, inside, she was learning, watching who supported which policies, noting who could be trusted, and understanding how fragile power truly was. One of the most telling moments of this period is the way Elizabeth balanced honesty with ambiguity. When Mary questioned her about Wyatt's rebellion, Elizabeth insisted she knew nothing of it. And it seems she truly did not. But what mattered was not the truth, it was how convincingly she could present herself as harmless. Her strength was not just in knowledge or charm. It was in mastering appearances, in understanding that perception could mean the difference between life and death. This period also tested Elizabeth's empathy. She could see how fear consumed her sister. Mary was not simply a tyrant. She was a woman who had lived her entire life under pressure, denied legitimacy, denied love, and denied the crown until late in life. Elizabeth must have recognized in Mary some of the same scars she carried herself. But she also saw how those scars had hardened Mary into suspicion and cruelty. Perhaps this contrast taught Elizabeth what kind of queen she did not want to become. By the mid-1550s, Elizabeth had survived imprisonment, interrogation, and near execution. She had come face to face with the reality that her life could be taken from her at any moment, not because of her actions, but because of what she represented. And yet, she emerged stronger, more cautious, and more prepared for the future. The girl who once sat by candlelight with her tutors was now a woman who understood the deadly game of politics. And she had proven that she could play it as well as anyone. When we look at this chapter of her life, it is easy to focus on the fear and the uncertainty. But what stands out more is Elizabeth's resilience. She did not allow suspicion to break her. She did not allow confinement to silence her spirit. Instead, she endured with patience, cultivated her self-control, and turned survival into an art. These years under Mary's reign were not wasted, they were Elizabeth's training ground. And when the crown eventually came to her, she carried with her not just the knowledge of books, but the lived experience of navigating suspicion, betrayal, and danger with unshakable composure. So by the time Elizabeth walked out of Mary's shadow, she was no longer simply the daughter of Anne Boleyn or the sister of a king. She was a survivor who had learned mercy, cunning, and discipline in the harshest of classrooms. And soon, she would be called upon to put all of those lessons to the test as the fate of England itself fell into her hands. When Mary Tudor's health began to fail in 1558, all eyes turned to Elizabeth. The woman who had once been locked away in the Tower, suspected and nearly destroyed, was suddenly the most likely heir to the throne of England. The transition was not smooth. Power never shifts easily, but on November 17, 1558, at the age of 25, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. For the first time in her life, she was no longer a pawn in other people's games. She was the one holding the crown, and the nation was watching. But if the coronation glittered with celebration, the reality behind it was far darker. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom that was in financial ruin, religiously fractured, and politically vulnerable. England's treasury was empty. Its people were exhausted by years of religious conflict, swinging back and forth between Catholic and Protestant rule. Neighboring powers like France and Spain, far wealthier and stronger, loomed like predators circling prey. And at the center of it all was Elizabeth, young, unmarried, and untested. From the very first day, Elizabeth showed she understood the importance of symbolism. At her coronation in January 1559, she walked into Westminster Abbey dressed in a white gown. the color of purity, with her red hair crowned and styled to catch the candlelight. The message was clear: she was the Virgin Queen, untouched, independent, and yet regal enough to command loyalty. While her counselors debated policies and foreign alliances, Elizabeth was already shaping the image that would define her reign. She understood something essential: that appearances were not frivolous. They were weapons. Still, appearances alone could not mend a broken nation. One of Elizabeth's first and most delicate challenges was religion. Her father's break with Rome, her brother Edward's Protestant reforms, and her sister Mary's Catholic restoration had left England bitterly divided. Families were torn apart, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and faith was not only a matter of belief but a matter of survival. Elizabeth knew she could not afford to lean too far in either direction. If she was too Protestant, she risked alienating Catholic nobles and sparking rebellion. If she was too Catholic, she would lose the trust of Protestant reformers who had already suffered under Mary's reign. Her solution was a religious settlement that became one of the defining acts of her early rule. She re-established Protestantism, but in a way that was careful, measured, and inclusive. The new Church of England would use English rather than Latin, and the monarch would serve as its supreme governor. Yet Catholics who outwardly conformed were largely left in peace, so long as they did not openly challenge her authority. It was not perfect, and it did not end religious tension altogether, but it was a compromise, a middle path that brought enough stability for England to move forward. This ability to navigate extremes was Elizabeth's genius. She did not seek to please everyone; that was impossible, but she knew how to create just enough balance to keep her enemies from uniting. It is a lesson leaders today could learn from. When faced with polarized sides, sometimes the wisest course is not to choose one completely but to carve out a space where coexistence, however uneasy, is possible. Beyond religion, Elizabeth faced another challenge almost immediately: marriage. The question of whom she would marry was not just gossip fodder. It was a matter of national security. For centuries, queens had been expected to marry, to produce heirs, and to form alliances through matrimony. Foreign princes and ambassadors flooded her court with proposals. Philip II of Spain, the powerful Catholic king who had once been married to her sister Mary, suggested himself. Protestant suitors from Sweden and the German states courted her as well. Even English nobles, like her childhood friend Robert Dudley, hoped to become more than companions. But Elizabeth, with a composure that stunned her council, deflected them all. She asked careful questions about treaties and dowries, listened politely, and then gave nothing away. She understood something radical: marriage meant sharing power, and in her case, it meant handing over England's sovereignty to a husband. She had seen what marriage had cost her sister Mary: public unpopularity, foreign entanglements, and political weakness. She would not repeat that mistake. So she played the game of diplomacy without ever committing, keeping suitors guessing, using proposals as leverage, but never allowing herself to be trapped. This decision shocked many at the time. How could a woman rule without a husband? How could England survive without a king beside her? Nobles muttered, foreign leaders sneered, and even her own advisers worried. But Elizabeth turned doubt into fuel. If the world expected her to lean on a man for power, she would prove them wrong. And that refusal to marry, far from weakening her, became one of the defining strengths of her reign. She became the Virgin Queen not because she lacked options but because she chose sovereignty over dependence. What makes this even more fascinating is how she managed the narrative. She did not simply say no to marriage, she reframed it. She declared herself married to England, her people, her children, her crown, her devotion. What could have been seen as stubbornness became, instead, a kind of holy sacrifice, a vow that elevated her above ordinary rulers. She was no longer just a queen. She was a symbol of unity, independence, and resilience. But let us not imagine it was all smooth sailing. Elizabeth's early reign was filled with tension, plots, and challenges. Catholic powers abroad considered her illegitimate and hoped to remove her. Nobles at home tested her authority. And always, in the background, was the question of succession. With no husband and no children, what would happen to England when she was gone? For Elizabeth, these were not easy questions to face, but she knew better than anyone that survival was not about finding easy answers. It was about holding steady, projecting confidence, and buying time until stronger foundations could be built. Looking back, it is clear that Elizabeth's first years as queen were crucial. They established the tone of her reign. She was careful but not weak. Firm but not inflexible, unmarried but not alone. She used appearances, symbolism, and diplomacy to buy herself the space she needed to govern. And slowly, against the odds, she began to transform a fractured kingdom into something stronger. So when we picture Elizabeth at 25, newly crowned, standing in her white gown with the crown glittering on her head, we should see more than ceremony. We should see a young woman stepping into the most dangerous job in Europe, armed not with an army or a fortune but with intelligence, patience, and an iron will. She was ready to prove that even in a world dominated by kings, a queen could be feared, respected, and admired. Elizabeth's decision to stand alone, to remain unmarried and independent, was more than a personal choice. It became the foundation for a new chapter in England's story. With her crown secure and her religious settlement in place, she now had to transform a fragile kingdom into a nation that could defend itself, prosper, and command respect on the world stage. This was not an easy task. Elizabeth inherited empty coffers, restless nobles, and neighbors who doubted her legitimacy. Yet in time, she would turn weakness into strength, and England into a rising power. One of her most remarkable achievements was her ability to steer the nation through the stormy seas of religion. She had already introduced her religious settlement, striking a delicate balance between Catholic traditions and Protestant reforms. But enforcing that compromise required more than a royal decree. It required patience and political genius. In towns and villages across England, people still clung fiercely to their faith, and religious identity was not just about belief but about loyalty. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. Instead of waging war against conscience, she insisted on outward conformity while allowing private worship to remain in the shadows. It was not tolerance in the modern sense, but in the 16th century it was revolutionary. It kept the peace, at least long enough for her government to stabilize, and it gave ordinary people a way to breathe. But if religion was one tightrope, foreign policy was another. Spain and France were the great powers of Europe, and both saw England as vulnerable. France supported Mary, Queen of Scots, who many Catholics believed had a stronger claim to the English throne. Spain, under King Philip II, resented Elizabeth's refusal to marry him and her Protestant faith. Both monarchs saw Elizabeth as a problem to be solved. For a young queen, barely in her 30s, it was an intimidating challenge. Elizabeth's answer was not to outmatch them with brute force that would have been impossible but to outthink them. She played Spain and France against each other, hinting at alliances, entertaining marriage proposals, and then backing away at the right moment. She kept her enemies guessing, never giving them certainty about her intentions. If diplomacy was a chessboard, Elizabeth was a master player, moving her pieces carefully, always several steps ahead. And then there was the question of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had returned to Scotland in 1561 after the death of her French husband, only to find her homeland a nest of Protestant lords unwilling to bow to a Catholic queen. Elizabeth watched her cousin's every move from across the border, wary of her charm and her claim to the throne of England. Over the years, Mary's presence became a magnet for conspiracy. Catholic plots, rebellions, and whispers of invasion all seemed to revolve around her. Elizabeth, cautious as ever, resisted the call to act too quickly. She hesitated for years, even when evidence mounted that Mary was at the center of schemes to overthrow her. But in the end, Elizabeth made the hardest choice of her reign. After the Babington Plot of 1586, when letters revealed Mary's involvement in plans to assassinate her, Elizabeth reluctantly signed the death warrant. Mary was executed in 1587, a decision that haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. She knew the cost of such an act. She was not just executing a rival. She was executing a fellow queen. Yet in that moment, Elizabeth proved she was willing to do what was necessary to secure her realm. It was an act of cold pragmatism, born not from cruelty but from survival. The following year, Elizabeth faced her greatest test yet, the Spanish Armada. King Philip II of Spain, enraged by Mary's death and Elizabeth's support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, launched a massive invasion fleet in 1588. It was the largest naval force Europe had ever seen, a floating fortress of over 100 ships, thousands of soldiers, and the weight of empire behind it. The plan was simple: sail up the English Channel, link with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and march on London. If successful, England would fall, and Elizabeth would be dethroned. The odds were terrifying. England's navy was smaller, its resources limited. Yet Elizabeth's leadership turned the tide. She trusted her commanders. Like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham, who used speed and strategy to harass the massive Spanish ships, the English employed fire ships to scatter the Armada, breaking its tight formation. Fierce storms battered the Spanish fleet as it retreated north around Scotland and Ireland. By the time survivors limped back to Spain, the invincible Armada was shattered. Elizabeth's role was not just strategic, it was symbolic. On the eve of battle, she rode out to address her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armor. Her voice steady as she declared that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. Those words echoed across history, not just as a rallying cry but as a declaration of what her reign represented: strength, resilience, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The victory over the Armada changed everything. England was no longer seen as a vulnerable island but as a rising power. Elizabeth's navy, once an afterthought, was now a force to be reckoned with. Her captains, men like Drake and Hawkins, became legends, their names feared on the seas. The victory did not just secure Elizabeth's throne, it secured England's future as a naval power, laying the foundations for an empire that would stretch across the globe. But what makes this chapter of Elizabeth's reign so fascinating is not just the battles won or the enemies defeated. It is the way she transformed weakness into strength. She did not rule with armies or endless wealth. She ruled with patience, with image, with strategy, and with an uncanny ability to understand the hearts of her people. When she spoke to them, they believed her. When she stood firm, they stood with her. And in that bond between queen and country, a new sense of English identity was born. By the end of the 1580s, Elizabeth was no longer the uncertain young woman struggling to prove herself. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had outmaneuvered kings and emperors, defeated the greatest armada the world had ever seen, and turned England into a power to be respected. And though challenges still lay ahead, she had shown that her reign was more than survival. It was the rise of a nation. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was more than just a military victory, it was the turning point that gave England confidence in its future. With the immediate threat from Spain repelled, Elizabeth's reign entered a new phase, one marked not only by survival but by growth, exploration, and cultural brilliance. This was the moment when England began to lift its gaze beyond its shores and imagine itself as something more than a vulnerable island nation. Elizabeth's navy, forged in the fires of the Armada, did not return quietly to port. Instead, her captains pushed further into uncharted waters. Men like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Hawkins carried England's flag across the Atlantic, raiding Spanish treasure fleets, establishing footholds in the New World, and opening trade routes that would eventually form the backbone of a global empire. At times, their actions were little more than piracy, but under Elizabeth's blessing, piracy became statecraft. Every Spanish ship captured, every chest of silver or gold seized, was not just profit, it was proof that England could challenge the mightiest empire of the age. Elizabeth herself encouraged these ventures, though always with caution. She was no reckless gambler. She understood the risks of angering powerful enemies. But she also knew that England could not remain passive. The wealth and opportunities of exploration were too great to ignore. So she walked the same careful line she had in politics and religion, encouraging progress, yet always making sure she could deny involvement if things went wrong. It was a balancing act that allowed England to expand without collapsing under the weight of its ambitions. At home, Elizabeth's reign became known as a golden age of culture. The court at Westminster and later at Greenwich transformed into a hub of art, music, and literature. The plays of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe brought stories to life that still resonate today. Composers created music that filled Elizabeth's chambers with sounds of majesty and devotion. Painters captured her image in portraits that were not just likenesses but tools of propaganda, carefully crafted to project her as timeless, almost divine. Elizabeth understood the power of culture as deeply as she understood the power of politics. She knew that to secure her legacy, she needed more than battles and treaties, she needed stories, symbols, and images that would outlast her. Her portraits often showed her with elaborate gowns glittering with jewels, symbols of purity like pearls, or her hand resting on a globe, suggesting her dominion stretched across the world. These were not vanity projects. They were statements of identity. Every brushstroke was a reminder to her subjects and to foreign courts that she was not just a queen, she was an icon. Yet behind the glitter and the celebrations, Elizabeth was growing older. The girl dismissed by her father, the prisoner under her sister. The cautious young queen was now a woman in her 50s and 60s, still sharp, still commanding, but feeling the weight of years. Her refusal to marry, which had once been criticized as reckless, was now praised as wisdom. She had avoided entangling England in dangerous alliances, preserved her independence, and maintained the loyalty of her people. But the price was personal loneliness. She had no husband, no children, no heir of her own blood. Her marriage to England had been absolute, and it meant sacrificing the comforts of family life. Even so, Elizabeth never let her private sacrifices overshadow her public role. She worked tirelessly, reading reports, meeting ambassadors, and guiding her council. She surrounded herself with skilled advisors like William Cecil and later his son Robert, men she trusted to manage the machinery of government while she remained the face and spirit of the monarchy. She listened to them, but always made the final decision herself. This was her reign, her vision, and she would not let anyone else define it. As the years passed, the world began to see England differently. No longer the weak and fractured kingdom she had inherited, it was now a nation with a growing navy, expanding trade, and a cultural life that rivaled any court in Europe. Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen became more than a clever piece of propaganda, it became a symbol of stability and unity. While kings and princes across the continent fell to assassinations, revolutions, or bankruptcy, Elizabeth endured. When she died in 1603, at nearly 70 years old, she left behind a country transformed. She had not built an empire in the modern sense that would come later under the Stuarts and beyond, but she had laid the foundation. She had secured the seas, fostered exploration, and given England the confidence to dream beyond its borders. More importantly, she had given her people something intangible but priceless: identity. Under Elizabeth, the English began to think of themselves not just as subjects of a kingdom, but as part of a nation that could stand against the greatest powers of the world. Her reign was not perfect. She faced rebellions, conspiracies, and economic struggles. She had moments of hesitation and moments of cruelty. But her greatness did not come from perfection, it came from persistence. She succeeded because she learned from her mistakes, surrounded herself with able counselors, and placed England's needs above her own. And for that, history remembers her not as a disappointment, not as a victim, but as Gloriana, the Queen who turned fragility into power and left a legacy that still echoes today. Elizabeth may have defeated the Armada and established herself as a powerful monarch. But one question never left her court, her counselors, or the whispers of foreign ambassadors: whom would she marry, from the moment she placed the crown on her head? Marriage was not just a personal matter, it was a political weapon, a bargaining chip, and, for many, the ultimate test of her reign. For most queens of Europe, marriage was inevitable. It secured alliances, produced heirs, and guaranteed stability. For Elizabeth, however, the question became a battlefield where she proved, time and again, that she would not let anyone dictate her future. The pressure was immense. At 25, newly crowned, Elizabeth was young and attractive. Suitors lined up from every corner of Europe, each proposal wrapped in promises of alliances and mutual protection. Philip II of Spain, the same monarch whose Armada she would later crush, offered himself soon after Mary Tudor's death. It was a shocking proposal, the widower of her sister, a powerful Catholic king, asking for the hand of a Protestant queen. Accepting him might have silenced Catholic opposition at home, but it would also have placed England firmly under Spanish influence. Elizabeth listened, smiled, and politely declined. Other suitors followed. The Archduke Charles of Austria, a member of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, was considered. So was Eric XIV of Sweden, who courted Elizabeth with gifts and promises of support for Protestantism. Even her own court had hopefuls, most famously Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who had been Elizabeth's childhood friend and perhaps her closest companion as queen. Their bond sparked endless gossip. Did Elizabeth love him? Did she intend to marry him? The rumors reached across Europe, and ambassadors reported breathlessly on every glance and gesture between the Queen and her favorite courtier. But Elizabeth never allowed those rumors to solidify into commitments. She played the game with skill, entertaining proposals, dangling the possibility of marriage when it suited her, diplomatically, and withdrawing when the time was right. In doing so, she kept her suitors and their countries guessing. France and Spain both hoped to win her hand and thus England's allegiance. But as long as Elizabeth remained unwed, she remained politically flexible, able to maneuver between rivals without being tied down. At home, however, the question of marriage was more complicated. Her counselors were deeply anxious about succession. Without a husband and children, who would inherit the throne after Elizabeth? They feared instability, civil war, or foreign invasion if the succession was not secured. Time and again, Parliament petitioned Elizabeth to marry, reminding her of her duty to provide an heir. Time and again, she sidestepped their pleas. She insisted she had not yet found the right match, or that marriage was a decision that must come in its own time. Behind her careful words, though, she had already made up her mind. She would not marry, not for love, not for politics, not for duty. Why? The reasons were layered. Part of it was personal. Elizabeth had seen firsthand the dangers of marriage for women in power. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had been elevated to queen only to be executed within 3 years. Her sister Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain had made her deeply unpopular, fueling resentment that weakened her reign. Elizabeth understood that taking a husband meant sharing power, and perhaps losing it altogether. She could not risk being overshadowed, manipulated, or used as a tool for another's ambitions. Part of it was also practical. Marriage would have tied England to one faction or another in Europe's tangled web of alliances. To marry a Catholic would enrage Protestants at home. To marry a Protestant would alienate Catholic nobles and risk war with Spain. To marry an English noble like Robert Dudley would cause resentment among the rest of the court, who would see it as favoritism. By refusing marriage altogether, Elizabeth avoided all these traps. And then there was the matter of image. Over time, Elizabeth transformed her singleness from a liability into a strength. She styled herself as the Virgin Queen, devoted not to a husband but to her people. In speeches, she referred to England as her spouse, her crown as her child, her duty as her lifelong companion. This rhetoric turned what might have been seen as failure, her refusal to marry, into a kind of sacred vow. The people admired her not for being incomplete but for being entirely theirs. Of course, the personal side of this decision was far more complicated. Elizabeth was human. She may have loved Robert Dudley, or at least felt for him something deeper than friendship. The scandal surrounding the death of his wife, Amy Robsart, in 1560 made marriage to him impossible. But it did not erase their bond. For Elizabeth, choosing not to marry did not mean she was immune to loneliness or longing. It meant she chose her crown over her heart, her country over her personal happiness. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of her reign, the way Elizabeth turned sacrifice into strategy. She gave up the possibility of family life, of a husband and children, and instead crafted an identity that elevated her above the expectations of her time. While other monarchs ruled with partners at their side, Elizabeth ruled alone and made that solitude into a source of mystique and authority. In the end, the marriage question never disappeared. It haunted her reign from beginning to end, resurfacing whenever a crisis arose. But Elizabeth never wavered. By staying single, she not only preserved her sovereignty but also reshaped what it meant to be a woman in power. She proved that a queen did not need a king to legitimize her. She proved that her authority, her intelligence, and her will were enough. So when we think of Elizabeth's refusal to marry, we should not see it simply as stubbornness or fear. We should see it for what it was, a bold, radical act of independence in a world that doubted women's ability to rule alone. It was her clearest statement of defiance, the choice that defined her reign as much as any battle or treaty. And in that choice, she carved her place in history not as the wife of a king, but as a sovereign in her own right. The Virgin Queen whose loyalty was not divided, whose power was not shared, and whose heart belonged entirely to England. Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried was bold, but it was only one part of the puzzle. The greater challenge, the one that could make or break her reign, was religion. Few things divided England more deeply than faith. For decades, the kingdom had been pulled back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. Under Henry VIII, England broke with Rome. Under Edward VI, Protestant reform spread widely. Under Mary Tudor, Catholic traditions were restored with a vengeance. And hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake. By the time Elizabeth became queen, the country was spiritually exhausted, and loyalties were dangerously split. Elizabeth understood that her first priority was to settle the religious question, not just for political convenience but for survival. She herself leaned toward Protestantism. Her education, her tutors, and her worldview had all been shaped by reformist ideas. But she also understood the danger of going too far, too fast. If she pushed Protestantism aggressively, she risked alienating Catholic nobles at home and provoking Catholic powers abroad, particularly Spain and France. If she leaned too much toward Catholicism, she would lose the support of the Protestants who had already endured years of persecution under Mary. Her solution was not compromise in the weak sense of the word, but compromise as strategy. In 1559, Elizabeth introduced what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It was a carefully crafted middle way, designed to bring stability without demanding absolute conformity. The settlement consisted of two main acts: the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Supremacy re-established the independence of the Church of England, declaring Elizabeth as its supreme governor. Notice that she chose the title governor rather than head. This was deliberate. Her father had called himself supreme head, but Elizabeth avoided language that might appear too radical or offensive to traditionalists. The Act of Uniformity required the use of the Book of Common Prayer in church services, reinstating Protestant worship but retaining certain Catholic-style rituals to reassure the more conservative faithful. What this created was a church that looked, on the surface, familiar to Catholics but was fundamentally Protestant in theology. Priests still wore vestments. Churches still used altars. But the Bible was read in English, and the authority of Rome was gone. This careful balance allowed people who valued tradition to feel comfortable, while also satisfying reformers who wanted scripture and worship accessible to ordinary believers. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a brilliant one. Because it gave England something it had not had in years: breathing room. Elizabeth also showed restraint in enforcement. While she demanded outward conformity, attendance at church was required by law. She did not launch mass persecutions of Catholics who remained loyal to their old faith in private. As long as they did not openly defy her authority or plot rebellion, many were left in peace. This approach, known as do not ask, do not tell by some historians, was not born of kindness alone. It was born of pragmatism. Elizabeth knew England could not afford endless religious wars like those ravaging parts of Europe. She needed unity, not purity. The settlement had far-reaching effects. It created what some called the via media, or middle way, which became a defining feature of the English Church. This middle ground not only kept England relatively stable during Elizabeth's reign but also shaped the Anglican tradition for centuries to come. More importantly, it sent a message about Elizabeth's style of rule. She was not a queen who demanded absolute obedience to one extreme. She was a queen who valued survival, stability, and balance above rigid ideology. Of course, not everyone was satisfied. Hardcore Protestants, known as Puritans, criticized the settlement for not going far enough. They wanted to strip away all traces of Catholic tradition and create a pure Protestant church. On the other side, Catholic loyalists saw Elizabeth's settlement as heresy, a betrayal of Rome and the Pope. For Elizabeth, this tension was a constant reality. But her genius was in holding the center. She resisted pressure from both sides, knowing that bending too far would topple the delicate balance she had built. It is worth pausing to see how modern this thinking feels. Even today, leaders are often caught between polarized factions, each demanding total loyalty. Elizabeth's ability to walk the line, to say enough for stability but not enough to destroy unity, is a lesson in leadership that feels timeless. She knew she could not please everyone, so she did not try. Instead, she focused on preventing chaos, understanding that sometimes the role of a ruler is not to deliver perfect justice but to maintain fragile peace. The settlement also played a crucial role in strengthening Elizabeth's image abroad. By defining England as Protestant but not radical, she made alliances with Protestant states possible while not provoking immediate all-out war with Catholic powers. Spain and France still eyed her with suspicion, but her moderation gave her breathing space, buying time until England was strong enough to defend itself. Over the years, this careful balancing act paid off. England did not collapse into civil war like France, where Catholics and Huguenots slaughtered each other in the streets. Nor did it fall under the weight of religious authoritarianism, as in Spain. Instead, under Elizabeth, England became a place where compromise, however uneasy, allowed progress. Exploration thrived. Trade expanded. Literature and art flourished. The kingdom, though still divided in private belief, was united enough to survive and even grow. For Elizabeth personally, the settlement was also a declaration of authority. By positioning herself as the supreme governor of the Church, she reinforced the idea that she was not just a queen in name but in every sense the head of her people's spiritual and political life. In an era when women were expected to defer to men, Elizabeth claimed spiritual leadership as her own. She did it cautiously, with titles chosen to soften the blow, but she did it nonetheless. And in doing so, she rewrote the rules of female power in a way no queen before her had managed. By the 1570s, cracks would begin to show. The Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, effectively declaring her illegitimate and encouraging Catholics to disobey her. Catholic plots, rebellions, and foreign threats would challenge her settlement again and again. But for more than a decade after her coronation, the religious question was quiet enough for her to strengthen her throne, stabilize her nation, and give England the chance to rise. Elizabeth's settlement reminds us that sometimes leadership is not about grand victories or sweeping reforms. Sometimes, it is about survival, about finding the narrow path between extremes and walking it with steady steps. In the England of the 16th century, where faith could ignite wars and tear nations apart, Elizabeth's middle way was nothing less than revolutionary. If the Elizabethan settlement had given England temporary stability, there was still one shadow Elizabeth could never quite escape. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was not just another monarch across the border. She was a Catholic queen with Tudor blood, a woman whose very existence posed a threat to Elizabeth's throne. For decades, Mary would be at the center of conspiracies, rebellions, and political storms, and her rivalry with Elizabeth became one of the defining dramas of the 16th century. Mary's story began in Scotland, where she became queen as an infant. Raised in France and married to the French Dauphin, she returned to Scotland a widow at just 19. Beautiful, charming, and Catholic, Mary seemed destined to capture hearts. But Scotland was no easy kingdom. Its powerful Protestant lords distrusted her, and its politics were vicious. Elizabeth, watching from London, must have felt both wary and curious. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not. Openly Catholic, married young, and, most importantly, a potential alternative for those who doubted Elizabeth's legitimacy as Queen of England. For Catholic Europe, Mary represented hope. To them, Elizabeth was the illegitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn, a heretic who had no right to the throne. Mary, on the other hand, descended directly from Henry VII's line through Margaret Tudor, Elizabeth's grandmother. To many, she had the stronger claim. That claim was like a spark in dry straw, waiting for the right moment to ignite. At first, Elizabeth tried diplomacy. She suggested friendship, even entertained the possibility of recognizing Mary's claim to succession if she married wisely. But Mary's choices complicated everything. Her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was himself of Tudor blood, and their marriage united two potential claims to the English throne. For Elizabeth, this was alarming. A single child from that union could overshadow her legitimacy entirely. And then came the scandal. In 1567, Darnley was murdered in Edinburgh under circumstances so shocking they seemed pulled from a play. His house was blown up. His body found strangled in the garden. Suspicion quickly fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who, in a twist that stunned even Mary's supporters, married her just months after the crime. To Elizabeth, this was not just poor judgment, it was political suicide. Across Scotland, nobles rebelled against Mary, accusing her of complicity in Darnley's death. Within a year, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, and fled across the border into England. It was then that Elizabeth faced the most difficult decision of her reign. Mary arrived at her doorstep, asking for sanctuary, pleading for her cousin's help in regaining her throne. What was Elizabeth to do? On one hand, Mary was family. On the other, she was a rival with a claim that could inspire rebellion. Elizabeth chose a middle path. She treated Mary with courtesy and respect but kept her under house arrest. A queen in name, Mary became a prisoner in England, and she would remain so for the next 19 years. At first glance, this might seem merciful. Elizabeth could have executed Mary immediately, removing the threat once and for all. But Elizabeth was cautious. She understood the risks of killing a crowned queen. To strike down Mary would set a dangerous precedent. It might encourage her enemies to do the same to her. So Elizabeth kept Mary alive, a prisoner who was always close enough to watch but never free enough to act. The problem was, Mary did not accept her captivity quietly. From the moment she arrived in England, she became the focal point of Catholic plots. Letters were smuggled to her in wine barrels. Messages hidden in embroidery and book bindings. Nobles who despised Elizabeth's Protestant settlement rallied around her. Foreign powers whispered promises of aid if she could be placed on the throne. And though Elizabeth resisted executing her, each new conspiracy made Mary's presence more dangerous. The most serious came in 1586, with the Babington plot. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman, conspired with foreign agents to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Secret letters, written in code, passed between Babington and Mary. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, intercepted them, patiently gathering evidence until Mary's complicity was undeniable. For years, Elizabeth had resisted. But now, with proof in hand, she could no longer delay. Even then, Elizabeth agonized. Signing Mary's death warrant was the hardest decision of her life. She delayed for months, searching for alternatives, hoping for some miracle that would allow her to avoid it. To execute Mary meant being remembered as the queen who killed her own cousin, the queen who spilled royal blood. It was a step Elizabeth dreaded to take, but in the end, survival demanded it. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She met her death with dignity, dressed in crimson, the color of Catholic martyrdom. For Elizabeth, the news was bittersweet. She had removed her greatest rival, but she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The execution shocked Europe, enraged Catholic monarchs, and deepened the divide between England and Spain. Yet it also ended decades of uncertainty. The threat within her own borders was gone. Mary's story is one of tragedy, but it is also a mirror for Elizabeth's resilience. Where Mary was impulsive, Elizabeth was cautious. Where Mary acted with passion, Elizabeth acted with calculation. History remembers Elizabeth as the survivor, the queen who endured, while Mary became the romantic figure, the queen who lost everything through ambition, scandal, and miscalculation. In the end, Mary's greatest legacy was not her claim to England's throne but her son. James VI of Scotland would one day inherit Elizabeth's crown, uniting England and Scotland under one monarch. In that sense, Mary's bloodline achieved what she herself could not. But it was Elizabeth's judgment, her discipline, and her willingness to make the hardest choices that ensured England survived long enough to see that union. Mary, Queen of Scots, may have haunted Elizabeth's reign, but she also sharpened it. Each plot, each conspiracy, each moment of danger forced Elizabeth to refine her skills, to balance mercy with pragmatism, and to hold her throne more tightly. Their rivalry was a tragedy for one and a triumph for the other, but together, their intertwined fates shaped the destiny of Britain itself. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth had survived more than 2 decades on the throne, but the greatest test of her reign was still ahead. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 had solved one problem but created another. For Catholic Europe, Mary's death was an outrage. For King Philip II of Spain, it was a personal insult. Elizabeth had executed a Catholic queen and continued to support Protestant rebels in the Netherlands against his rule. The tension that had simmered for years now erupted into open conflict, and Philip prepared an answer so massive that it would be remembered as one of the greatest military threats England ever faced: the Spanish Armada. Spain was the most powerful empire of the age. Its vast colonies in the Americas poured gold and silver into Philip's treasury. Its armies were seasoned, its navy immense. Against such a force, England seemed fragile. Yet Philip was convinced this was the moment to strike. His plan was simple but bold: send a fleet of more than 130 ships up the English Channel, rendezvous with his army in the Netherlands, and then ferry 30,000 troops across the Channel to invade England. Once landed, they would march on London, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. In Philip's mind, it was the will of God. For Elizabeth and her counselors, the danger could not have been clearer. If the Spanish succeeded, her reign would end in disaster, and England would become a Spanish vassal. But Elizabeth was not a woman to cower before the storm. Instead, she prepared her nation with the same blend of caution and confidence that had defined her rule. Her spymaster, Francis Walsingham, had already provided intelligence about the Armada's preparations. Shipyards in Spain were building day and night. Supplies were being stockpiled, soldiers recruited. England had time to prepare, but only just. The English navy was smaller, but it had advantages. Under leaders like Sir Francis Drake, Lord Howard of Effingham, and John Hawkins, the fleet was fast, maneuverable, and crewed by sailors hardened by years of raiding Spanish ships. Elizabeth's captains understood that they could not meet the Armada head-on in traditional battle. Instead, they would use speed, firepower, and cunning tactics to wear the Spanish down. In July 1588, the Armada appeared off the coast of England. Imagine the sight: over 100 towering galleons and supply ships stretched across the horizon. Sails billowing, crosses painted on flags, cannon ports ready for war. To the English watching from the cliffs, it must have looked like an unstoppable wall of power. And yet, within days, the myth of Spanish invincibility began to crumble. The English harried the Armada as it sailed up the Channel, using smaller, faster ships to dart in, fire, and retreat before the lumbering Spanish galleons could respond. At the Battle of Gravelines, they unleashed fire ships' vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the tightly packed Spanish formation. Panic spread. Chains broke, and the Armada scattered. Storms and unfavorable winds added to Spain's misery. By the time the Armada retreated north around Scotland and Ireland, it was a shattered force. Less than half of the fleet returned home. The invincible Armada had been humbled. But perhaps the most enduring image of this victory is not of ships or storms but of Elizabeth herself. At Tilbury, where English troops gathered to defend against invasion, she rode out to address them in person. Dressed in armor, mounted on a white horse, she delivered words that would echo through history. She knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman. She said, but she possessed the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. The speech electrified her soldiers. In that moment, Elizabeth became not just a queen but a symbol, embodying the courage and resilience of her nation. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military triumph. It was a turning point in Europe's balance of power. Spain, though still wealthy and vast, would never again be able to dominate the seas with the same authority. England, once seen as small and vulnerable, had proven it could stand against the greatest empire of the day. The psychological impact was enormous. The victory gave Elizabeth a new aura of invincibility, and her people began to see themselves not just as survivors but as a nation destined for greatness. What is remarkable is how much of this victory was not just about ships and guns but about leadership. Elizabeth did not command the navy herself. But her decisions, her trust in her captains, her use of intelligence, her ability to inspire her people were crucial. She understood that battles are fought not only on the water but in the hearts of soldiers and citizens. Her presence at Tilbury, her words, her composure, all turned fear into resolve. This episode also highlights Elizabeth's gift for turning survival into story. She knew the power of image and narrative. The Armada became more than a battle, it became a legend. The tale of a small nation standing up to a giant and winning. That legend, carefully nurtured, became part of the identity of England itself, shaping how the people saw themselves for generations. Of course, the war with Spain did not end in 1588. Smaller armadas were launched in the following years, and England continued to battle Spain on sea and land. But the Great Armada of 1588 was the decisive moment. It transformed Elizabeth from a cautious ruler into a heroic figure, Gloriana, the warrior queen who defied an empire. For Elizabeth personally, the victory was vindication. All the doubts, the criticisms, the questions about her legitimacy, her singleness, her strength, suddenly, they seemed irrelevant. She had faced the mightiest enemy in Europe and prevailed. And though she knew the challenges of rule were far from over, she had given her people something that mattered just as much as survival: belief. The story of the Armada is not just the story of ships on the sea. It is the story of a queen who understood the value of patience, preparation, and inspiration. It is the story of a nation discovering its strength. And it is the story of how Elizabeth, against all odds, transformed from a vulnerable monarch into one of the most feared and respected rulers in history. The victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not just a moment of survival, it was the spark that lit England's ambition to become something greater. For centuries, England had been a small island kingdom. overshadowed by continental powers like France and Spain. But after the Armada, a shift began. Elizabeth and her captains recognized that naval strength was not merely a shield against invasion. It was a key that could unlock the wealth of the world. What followed was the beginning of England's rise as a maritime power, and though Elizabeth did not live to see the full scope of empire, the foundations were laid firmly during her reign. The English Navy, once seen as little more than a coastal defense force, transformed into a source of pride and confidence. Men like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Hawkins became household names, celebrated not only for their daring raids on Spanish treasure fleets but also for their bold exploration of new lands. To the Spanish, they were pirates. To the English, they were heroes. They carried the Queen's blessing, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, and every chest of silver or gold they captured weakened Spain while strengthening England. These expeditions were more than plunder. They opened doors to trade routes that would expand over the coming centuries. English ships reached the Americas, Africa, and even Asia, bringing back exotic goods, tobacco, potatoes, sugar, and spices that transformed English life. The seas became highways of opportunity, and for the first time, England began to imagine itself not just as a European kingdom but as a player on the global stage. Elizabeth's support of these ventures was cautious but clever. She was careful never to overcommit resources to risky adventures. But she understood the importance of encouraging enterprise. Raleigh's attempt to establish a colony in the New World Roanoke, the so-called Lost Colony, was a failure. But it was also a vision of what could be. The dream of planting English settlements across the ocean was born under Elizabeth, even if it would take later monarchs to bring it fully to life. At home, the Navy's successes created a new sense of identity. Englishmen began to see themselves as seafarers, defenders of Protestant liberty, and challengers of Spanish dominance. The songs, poems, and stories of the time celebrated not just the Queen but the daring sailors who risked their lives on the open seas. When people spoke of England, they no longer spoke only of green fields and castles, they spoke of ships, oceans, and horizons waiting to be conquered. Elizabeth, ever the master of image, used this to her advantage. She elevated the captains of her navy to the status of legends, rewarding them with titles and honors, while also making sure their glory reflected back onto her. When Drake circumnavigated the globe, she knighted him aboard his ship, turning his triumph into a royal spectacle. When Raleigh dazzled the court with tales of the New World, she encouraged the idea that his vision was inseparable from her reign. The achievements of her captains were folded into the myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who ruled not just England but the seas themselves. Yet this expansion was not without its darker side. The same voyages that brought wealth and discovery also laid the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade. Hawkins, one of Elizabeth's trusted captains, was among the first Englishmen to profit from transporting enslaved Africans to the Americas. Elizabeth invested in some of his voyages, though she likely saw them more as trade ventures than as the monstrous system they would later become. Still, it is a reminder that even in its beginnings, England's global reach was marked by both brilliance and brutality. Despite these complexities, Elizabeth's reign undeniably shifted England's destiny. By the end of the 16th century, the idea of empire was no longer a fantasy but a possibility. The navy had proven its strength, trade routes had been opened, and colonies had been attempted. England was no longer a nation cowering before Spain, it was a nation that Spanish sailors feared. A nation whose flag appeared in waters once dominated exclusively by Iberian powers. The cultural life of the court reflected this confidence. Explorers were celebrated in plays, poems, and pageants. Maps were decorated with English ships sailing proudly across vast oceans. The Queen herself was often painted with her hand resting on a globe, a subtle but powerful symbol that her reign stretched beyond the island of Britain. These images were not just decoration, they were propaganda, telling the world and her people that England was rising, that the age of discovery belonged to them as much as to Spain or Portugal. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is how Elizabeth balanced ambition with caution. She never allowed herself to be carried away by dreams of empire. She invested enough to encourage exploration and privateering but avoided draining her treasury with costly wars of expansion. She preferred to test the waters literally and figuratively rather than dive headfirst into empire building. In this way, she laid foundations that were strong, flexible, and ready for future monarchs to build upon. By the twilight of her reign, England was no longer a vulnerable island fending off invaders. It was a naval power in its own right, feared and respected across Europe, and increasingly present in the wider world. Elizabeth had not created an empire, but she had created the conditions that made one inevitable. She left her successors a nation with confidence, ambition, and a navy capable of carrying both. For Elizabeth, this was the true legacy of her later years. She had not only protected her throne, she had transformed the very identity of her people. She had turned England outward, toward the seas, toward discovery, toward the future. And though she could not know it, the ripples of her decisions would carry across centuries, shaping the course of history far beyond her lifetime. By the closing years of Elizabeth's reign, the golden image of the Virgin Queen still dazzled Europe. But behind the portraits and pageantry, time was catching up with her. She had ruled for more than 4 decades, a lifetime by the standards of the 16th century. And her body began to feel the weight of years. The once vibrant queen with fiery red hair and tireless energy now struggled with aching joints, restless nights, and the quiet solitude that came with age. Yet even as her strength waned, her will remained ironclad. Elizabeth refused to give in to frailty, for she knew better than anyone that queens did not show weakness. Her later portraits tell a story of both brilliance and defiance. Artists painted her with ageless features, elaborate gowns shimmering with pearls and jewels, symbols of purity and eternal majesty. But those who saw her in private noticed the truth: her hair thinning, her skin marked with the passage of time, her figure more fragile than the painted goddess who stared confidently from the canvas. Elizabeth understood the power of image, and so she allowed herself to be seen as she wished to be. Remembered, timeless, unyielding, the eternal queen. Even in her final years, she worked tirelessly. Reports piled on her desks, ambassadors crowded her chambers, and she continued to weigh decisions with the same sharp intelligence that had carried her through rebellions, invasions, and plots. She surrounded herself with trusted advisors like Robert Cecil, who managed much of the state's business, but she never surrendered control. The crown, to her, was not a burden to be handed off but a responsibility to be carried to the very end. Yet for all her strength, Elizabeth could not escape the question that had haunted her entire reign: succession. She had no husband, no children, no direct heir of her body. Whispers filled the court about who might inherit when she was gone. Some feared civil war, others foreign invasion. Elizabeth herself remained silent on the matter, perhaps believing that naming a successor would invite conspiracy while she lived. But the reality was clear: her cousin James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the most likely candidate. The irony was striking. The woman Elizabeth had executed for being a threat to her throne had given birth to the very man who would wear her crown. In early 1603, Elizabeth's health declined rapidly. She grew weak, refusing food, sitting for long hours in silence, lost in thought. Those who served her begged her to rest. But she resisted. To take to her bed, she said, was to admit defeat, and she would not yield until the last moment. Finally, in March, she could no longer fight the inevitable. She withdrew to Richmond Palace, where she lay surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting and loyal counselors. Even then, she resisted naming a successor outright, but her gestures and words made it clear, James of Scotland would follow her. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at the age of 69. She had ruled for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. When the news spread, bells tolled across London, and the people mourned deeply. For many, she was the only monarch they had ever known, the queen who had guided them through decades of turmoil, war, and triumph. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart line, but her legacy was already secured. Elizabeth had inherited a bankrupt, divided, and vulnerable kingdom. She left behind a nation more united, more confident, and more powerful than ever before. She had defeated the greatest empire of her age, expanded trade and exploration, and presided over a cultural flowering that gave the world Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spencer. She had proven that a woman could rule as effectively as any king, and perhaps more wisely than most. Elizabeth's legacy is not one of perfection. Her reign had its share of failures, from economic struggles to political executions. But what sets her apart is the way she transformed obstacles into triumphs. She took her father's disappointment, her sister's suspicion, and her cousin's rivalry and turned them into stepping stones. She ruled not through brute force but through intelligence, patience, and the mastery of image and narrative. She became not just a monarch but a myth, remembered as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a symbol of England's spirit and resilience. Even now, centuries later, her story resonates. It is the story of someone underestimated, dismissed, even threatened with death, who rose to become one of the most respected rulers in history. It is the story of survival, sacrifice, and vision. Elizabeth showed that true strength is not the absence of struggle but the ability to endure it with dignity. She proved that power is not always about conquest or heirs. It is about leaving a legacy that endures long after you are gone. When we look back on her reign, we see more than history. We see lessons, that leadership requires balance as well as boldness, that image can be as powerful as armies, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from force but from persistence. Elizabeth did not just rule England, she shaped its identity, planting the seeds of a nation that would one day command the oceans and influence the world. So when the bells of London rang out that spring morning in 1603, they did not just mourn the passing of a queen. They celebrated the life of a woman who had turned fragility into power, solitude into sovereignty, and survival into greatness. Elizabeth I was gone, but the age she created, the Elizabethan age, would echo forever. And so, the story of Elizabeth I comes to its close. From a child born under her father's disappointment, a princess who lost her mother and even her royal title, to a young woman imprisoned in the Tower of London, Elizabeth endured every doubt and danger fate could place upon her. Yet instead of breaking, she learned to listen, to observe, to wait, and to seize her moment. Those years of uncertainty shaped the steel within her. When the crown was placed upon her head, Elizabeth became more than the queen of a divided land. She became the symbol of hope itself. She steered the nation through religious fractures with balance and care. She turned the question of marriage, once seen as her weakness, into a diplomatic weapon that made all of Europe watch her every move. And when Spain's mighty Armada threatened her shores, she proved that she was not just the queen of a throne, but the leader of a people who stood strong against the storm. What made Elizabeth truly extraordinary was not only the victories she won, but the story she created around herself. She became an icon, a living legend who bound her people together. When she declared that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, she redefined leadership. Power was no longer about gender or inheritance, it was about vision, persistence, and the ability to inspire a nation to believe. Her legacy stretched far beyond her time. Under Elizabeth, England was no longer a trembling island at the mercy of stronger empires. It became a nation of explorers, dreamers, and creators. The voyages across oceans, the plays of Shakespeare, the music, the art, all of it formed what history now calls the Elizabethan Age. But the greatest lesson of her story is not simply national pride, it is a universal truth. Elizabeth was not given an easy path. She was dismissed, underestimated, even seen as a threat. And yet, from those disadvantages, she built her strength. She showed that true power lies not in swords or armies, but in patience, wisdom, and an unshakable belief in one's destiny. And perhaps that is the message her life leaves us today. No matter where you start, no matter the doubts or pressures you face, history is not only written by those born with privilege. It is also written by those who dare to transform weakness into strength, and challenge into opportunity. Elizabeth I did exactly that, and her reign proves that even in the harshest times, a person can turn survival into greatness. So, as we close tonight's story, let the image of the Virgin Queen remind us that you cannot always control where your journey begins, but you can decide how to write the ending. Elizabeth chose to write an age, and that is why her name still echoes through the centuries.